The first time you hear about it, the story feels impossible. A convent, ancient and silent, tucked away from the eyes of the world, where mothers arrived carrying life in their wombs, and left carrying grief, fear, and questions they were never allowed to voice. You need to understand, this isn't just a story about cruelty. It's a story about control. About a system so precise, so insidious, that it turned birth, the most sacred, primal act, into a mechanism of silence. Imagine walking through the stone corridors of that place at night. The walls breathe a cold, calculated history. No cries, no laughter, only the echo of footsteps in empty halls. For centuries, the convent operated under the guise of sanctity, but the truth hidden behind those iron gates was far darker. Mothers were sent there for reasons that seemed trivial: immorality, scandal, poverty, but the real reason was never theirs to know. Their bodies became instruments in a system designed to sever bonds before they could form. The children born within those walls, they were called silent babies. Not for a medical condition, not for a lack of voice, but because the world would never hear their lives. The convent's leaders had a ritualized way of erasing their existence. Names were stripped away. Records disappeared. Even memory itself was pressured, like water through a sieve. And those who questioned it were quickly taught the lesson that silence was survival. Mothers left carrying guilt, fear, shame, and an understanding they couldn't name, that the world they thought they knew was manipulated in ways most could never imagine. What I'm about to show you isn't myth. Not entirely. It's history. Forbidden knowledge, suppressed by centuries of institutional power. And if you think this is just a story of one convent, you're already missing the point. This pattern, the erasure of life, the manipulation of those who are powerless, is a thread that runs through empires, religions, and secret societies alike. It is the blueprint for control, practiced silently, often under the guise of care, morality, or divine will. And now, it's time you saw it. Not as a spectator, not as someone safely distanced from it, but as a man waking up to the machinery of silence and power that has operated behind closed doors for longer than you dare imagine. You are stepping into a history you were never meant to witness. And once you hear it, nothing will feel the same again. By the time a woman crossed the threshold of that convent, the process had already begun. She wasn't told she was entering a system of erasure. She was told she was being protected. Protected from shame. Protected from society. Protected from herself. This is how real control works, not with chains, but with language. Words chosen carefully to reframe imprisonment as mercy, obedience as virtue, silence as holiness. The mothers were stripped of identity before they were ever stripped of choice, and most never realized it was happening until it was too late. Inside, time dissolved. Days blended into ritual. Bells dictated movement. Prayers replaced questions. Exhaustion replaced resistance. Psychological control doesn't rely on violence at first. It relies on repetition. Wake. Kneel. Eat in silence. Confess sins you didn't commit. Over time, the mind learns that peace only comes when you stop asking why. This is how institutions don't just control bodies. They reshape perception itself. A woman who arrived frightened but hopeful slowly became compliant, then grateful, then afraid to leave. That was the design. Pregnancy was treated not as creation, but as consequence. The mothers were constantly reminded that their condition was evidence of moral failure. Shame was the currency. Shame ensured obedience. Shame ensured silence. And when a system convinces you that you deserve punishment, it no longer needs guards. You police yourself. You surrender without being touched. This is an ancient technique, used by empires and religions alike, perfected long before modern psychology gave it a name. When the time of birth approached, the atmosphere changed. The warmth vanished. Compassion narrowed. Mothers were discouraged from bonding, discouraged from hope, discouraged from naming what grew inside them. Because names create attachment, and attachment creates resistance. In some cases, the child was taken immediately. In others, the mother was told the baby was too weak, too sick, or simply called by God. No proof, no body, no grave, only silence, enforced by authority and fear of eternal judgment. What matters is not just what happened to the children, but what happened to the men and women who were taught to accept it. This convent was not an anomaly. It was a laboratory, a place where techniques of emotional severance were refined, where human bonds were studied, weakened, and broken systematically. And those techniques didn't stay behind stone walls. They spread outward, into schools, hospitals, governments, media, anywhere control needed to look benevolent. If this unsettles you, it should, because the same mechanisms still exist. They just wear cleaner clothes now. And here's where the horror deepens, not in the overt cruelty, but in the precision of the system. Every movement, every ritual, every whispered command had a purpose, to mold minds into obedience and bodies into compliance. The nuns themselves, those who carried out the work, were not monsters in the ordinary sense. They were instruments, trained to believe that their cruelty was divine. They had been indoctrinated, themselves broken and rebuilt, so that their sense of morality was entirely subservient to the institution's objectives. The mothers entering the convent carried hope. They carried dreams of life, of family, of continuation. And one by one, those dreams were dismantled. The convent was designed to strip them of agency at the deepest psychological levels. Meals were controlled. Sleep was regulated. Prayer became a mechanism of self-surveillance. Every glance from a superior, every reprimand, every small correction was a subtle reinforcement. You are powerless. You are replaceable. You are invisible. And the mind, when confronted with relentless pressure, adapts. It becomes compliant. It forgets to fight. It forgets itself. This is how the silent babies were born, not merely into isolation, but into a system that erased their very existence before they could cry. There were no birth announcements, no letters, no records. The convent became both a womb and a grave. The mothers were left with an emptiness that could not be spoken, for the words themselves had been weaponized against them. To ask questions was to invite punishment, both spiritual and social. Silence became safety. Obedience became life itself. And yet, the power of the convent extended far beyond its stone walls. Local authorities, clerics, and even families colluded, knowingly or unknowingly, in the machinery of erasure. Secrets like this are never sustained by one group alone. They require networks, complicity, and the illusion of righteousness. A woman's suffering became a lesson for the rest of society. Defiance would be punished, compliance rewarded. The system didn't just teach obedience, it taught the fear that sustains obedience long after the enforcers are gone. This is the essence of hidden control. Not brute force, but psychological precision. Not visible chains, but invisible ones far stronger. And what's wise, when you look closely, you'll see echoes of this same system everywhere. In institutions, corporations, governments, even in families. The convent was extreme, but it was not unique. It was a mirror, reflecting the quiet, invisible ways that power manipulates, disciplines, and erases what it cannot control. The deeper you descend, the more you realize, the world you think you know is curated, designed, and the convent was just one of its most chilling laboratories. The severing of mother and child was not left to chance. It was methodical, ritualized, and terrifyingly effective. From the moment of conception, the convent's methods were designed to weaken the bond before it could even form. Mothers were discouraged from speaking to their children in the womb. They were told not to imagine the future, not to hope, not to dream. Attachment was painted as dangerous, sinful, and selfish. The human need to nurture was recast as a liability. At birth, the child was often taken immediately. Some were hidden away in rooms that smelled of antiseptic and stone. Others were quietly handed over to outsiders who disappeared into the shadows, never to return. Mothers were given excuses, gentle lies, or accusations of failure. They were trained to accept the absence, to internalize guilt as proof of moral corruption. In this way, control was complete. It began with the mind, extended to the body, and ended with the soul. The convent relied on isolation as its most powerful weapon. Women were kept apart from one another, carefully monitored, and denied the natural support of shared grief or solidarity. Emotional expression became a crime. Tears were considered a weakness, questions a temptation of sin. Over time, the mothers began to police themselves. They learned that survival meant obedience, that silence meant life, that the world beyond the walls could only harm them if they resisted. But the convent did more than remove the children. It removed memory. Rituals of confession and prayer were designed to override personal experience, to replace natural feelings of love and attachment with fear, shame, and obedience. Mothers were forced to relive their perceived sins repeatedly, as if to convince them that their suffering was deserved. And the deeper the internalized shame, the easier it became for the institution to bend reality to its will. The psychological implications are profound. This was not just cruelty. It was a blueprint for erasure. Human identity, parental instinct, and natural attachment were weaponized, turned into tools of submission. And the effects did not stop at the convent walls. Women returned to the world carrying invisible scars, carrying obedience shaped by fear, carrying a knowledge they could never fully articulate, a knowledge that would haunt them and shape the next generation. To truly understand this, you have to see the convent not as an isolated horror, but as a lens into the mechanics of control. Every silent child, every hidden birth, every enforced grief is a case study in how power operates unseen, how it teaches us to accept erasure as divine law, and how it manipulates the very core of human instinct. The deeper you look, the more you realize the convent was not chaotic. It was a hierarchy of secrets, a meticulously engineered chain of power that few ever saw in its entirety. At the top were the leaders, women who had been trained to believe that the world itself was flawed and that only their methods preserved divine order. They held knowledge so forbidden, so dangerous, that it was whispered only behind locked doors, away from prying eyes, away from the naive hearts of the mothers who had been sent to them. These leaders understood something most people never grasp. Control is far more powerful when it is invisible. They did not need to threaten with sticks or chains. They had cultivated fear, loyalty, and obsession in equal measure. Every ritual, every doctrine, every subtle manipulation was designed to ensure compliance without question. Knowledge itself became a weapon. Hidden instructions, secret codes, and arcane rules shaped how the convent functioned, how mothers responded, and how life itself was curated. The silent babies were part of this system. They were not anomalies, they were instruments. Their existence, or non-existence, served to reinforce the authority of the leaders. To the mothers, the removal of their children felt like divine judgment. To the leaders, it was a calculated demonstration, proof that obedience is rewarded, defiance punished, and silence enforced. No detail was accidental. Every tear, every confession, every whispered prayer was part of a grand experiment in control. And there were layers even beyond the leaders themselves. Advisors, clerics, and even external patrons provided guidance, funding, and tacit approval. The convent existed in a network of power that extended far beyond its walls. Secrets were traded like currency, knowledge hoarded like treasure, and silence enforced like law. If a mother tried to speak, she did not just risk punishment, she risked erasure, ostracism, and ruin. The system ensured that curiosity was stamped out before it could bloom. What's chilling is the subtlety. This was not horror in the obvious sense. There were no grand tortures, no dramatic violence. The horror was psychological, spiritual, and systemic. And it worked. Those who entered the convent rarely left unchanged. Some never left at all. Others returned, broken in ways invisible to the world, carrying obedience, fear, and secrets they could never share. The pattern is familiar to those who study power. Institutions that wield authority often operate the same way. They cultivate dependency, manipulate guilt, erase memory, and enforce silence. The convent is extreme, but it is not unique. It is a concentrated lens through which we can see the mechanisms of invisible power, and the lengths to which those in control will go to maintain dominance. The moment of birth, something every human instinctively associates with hope, love, and continuation, was weaponized. In the convent, birth became a controlled, almost surgical event, stripped of humanity, stripped of joy. Mothers were guided into cold, sterile rooms. Nuns hovered, not to comfort, but to monitor, record, and evaluate. Every heartbeat, every cry, every instinctive touch was observed, measured, and corrected. The natural bond between mother and child was treated as a threat, something to be neutralized. Mothers were instructed to suppress every impulse, hold the baby at a distance, avoid prolonged eye contact, do not speak, do not touch unnecessarily. They were told that love was dangerous, that attachment invited temptation, and that longing was sin. And the children, innate receptacles of life and trust, were met with an absence of warmth, a deliberate emotional void. They were trained, even from their first moments, to accept neglect. Silence was not just expected, it was cultivated. Some babies were taken immediately after birth. Others were hidden in secret chambers, their presence known only to the leaders. Names were stripped, identities erased. Birth certificates, if they existed at all, were falsified, hidden, or destroyed. Each act was a lesson: your life is not your own. Your existence is subordinate to the will of the powerful. Mothers were left with grief they could never voice and shame they were conditioned to internalize. The convent's obsession with ritual extended even to death. Stillborn children, or those deemed too weak, were quietly removed. Funerals were rare, if allowed at all, because public acknowledgement risked breaking the carefully constructed illusion of order. Mothers were taught to accept absence as divine law, to channel grief into obedience, and to carry the invisible weight of their children's erased lives. Psychological scars were deliberately cultivated. A mother who mourned too deeply was reminded, weakness invites ruin. Acceptance ensures survival. The mechanisms used here are frighteningly sophisticated. They anticipate every natural human response: love, grief, anger, and subvert it. Over time, the mother begins to police herself, internalizing the rules, believing that compliance is virtue and resistance is sin. And the child, if they survive, grows into a life already preconditioned for submission, unaware that their first lesson in obedience came not from the world, but from the very people sworn to protect them. This is why the story of the silent babies is more than history. It is a study in power, psychology, and control. It is a demonstration of how systems can manipulate instinct, erase identity, and reshape generations, all under the guise of sanctity. And it is a warning: extreme institutions may disappear, but the techniques they perfected live on, hidden in plain sight, shaping the world you think you know. Resistance existed, of course. Not every mother accepted her fate silently. Some whispered in corners, sharing fragmented plans, fleeting hope, or a single, dangerous act of defiance. But the convent was prepared for this. It did not rely solely on punishment. It relied on observation, isolation, and psychological manipulation. Even before a mother acted, the seeds of doubt and fear were planted. The environment itself became a weapon. Every hallway, every locked door, every set of eyes watching from shadowed alcoves reminded her that rebellion was not only futile, it was suicidal. The convent cultivated informants among the mothers. Those who complied were rewarded with small privileges, creating layers of mistrust and paranoia. The result: women monitored each other, reporting even the smallest hint of questioning or emotional attachment. Defiance became self-policed. The mothers internalized the rules so thoroughly that resistance was almost inconceivable. The silent babies were both symptom and tool. They embodied the absolute power the convent held over life itself. To challenge it was to challenge existence. Even acts of rebellion, when they occurred, were transformed into lessons for all. A mother might attempt to hide her child, to speak out, or to plead for mercy, but the consequences were immediate, brutal, and invisible to outsiders. Publicly, the convent maintained its sanctity. Privately, it made an example of those who failed to obey. Punishments were not always physical. Many were psychological: prolonged isolation, manipulated confessions, threats of eternal damnation, and the careful destruction of trust. In this system, terror became normalized, almost invisible, because it was woven into every interaction. And yet, the attempts at resistance reveal something profound. They prove that even in the most oppressive environments, human instinct fights to survive. Love fights to survive. Identity fights to survive. But the convent was designed to anticipate these instincts. Every plan, every act of courage, every instinctive attempt to protect a child or reclaim autonomy was met with calculated intervention. The mothers learned, often too late, that the system was not merely punitive, it was anticipatory. The lesson here is chilling. Control that is subtle, systemic, and invisible is far more effective than brute force. It breaks the mind before it breaks the body. It teaches compliance before rebellion is even conceived. And once compliance is internalized, obedience is permanent. These women, and their silent children, became proof that power need not be overt to be absolute. The leaders of the convent did not simply enforce rules, they wielded rituals. Behind locked doors, in rooms no mother was allowed to enter, they conducted ceremonies that were part psychological warfare, part invocation of authority. These rituals were designed to reaffirm their absolute control over life, over birth, over memory itself. Every chant, every gesture, every written symbol was calculated to reinforce the hierarchy. They weren't superstitious acts, they were mechanisms of domination, encoded into behavior, perception, and belief. In these ceremonies, the leaders invoked silence as power. They treated it almost as a force of nature, something sacred, something to be worshipped. Mothers and babies alike were the instruments on which silence was tested, measured, and perfected. The rituals were secret not to protect piety, but to protect the efficiency of control. They taught that obedience was divine, compliance was holy, and questioning was blasphemy. Every mother who entered the convent internalized this, often without ever witnessing the ceremonies themselves. The fear was enough. The psychological implications were staggering. The leaders used knowledge as a weapon. They memorized every pattern, every weakness, every tendency in their wards. They knew how to push, when to pull back, and how to tame natural human instinct into submission. Mothers were conditioned to self-doubt, guilt, and perpetual vigilance over their own behavior. The silent babies were not just victims, they were living instruments, proof of the efficacy of this invisible system. And there was a deeper layer of corruption, one hidden from history books. The leaders' rituals were tied to networks outside the convent. They exchanged knowledge, instructions, and even genetic control mechanisms with elites who understood that controlling the next generation was the ultimate power. Birth, life, and death became manipulable tools, not sacred acts. The convent was a laboratory of obedience, a crucible where human instinct was reshaped to shoot a higher, hidden agenda. These ceremonies also reinforced complicity among the nuns themselves. Those who carried out the work were initiated into knowledge that others could never access, binding them through secrecy, fear, and privilege. Knowledge became the chain, loyalty the shackle, and silence the ultimate weapon. The mothers, meanwhile, existed in a liminal state, alive, aware, yet powerless, witnessing the machinery of control in ways they could never fully understand. By now, you should feel the weight of it. The convent is not merely a historical curiosity. It is a case study in the most efficient forms of human control, perfected over centuries, hidden behind sanctity and ritual. And as we continue, you will see that even this is only the beginning of the machinery that erases life, shapes obedience, and manipulates the human psyche. The fate of the silent babies is the darkest part of this story. Few records exist, and those that do are fragmented, intentionally obscured, or falsified. But piecing together eyewitness accounts, confessions, and the few surviving documents reveals a chilling pattern. Babies were removed, hidden, or transferred to shadowy networks connected to the convent. Some were adopted into secret families loyal to the institution. Others disappeared entirely, their existence erased as if they had never been born. The corridors of the convent had rooms the mothers were never allowed to see. Some were lined with cradles, abandoned after a child was deemed unfit or inconvenient. Others held infants in silence, never spoken to, their names stripped away, their cries punished or ignored. The leaders treated these rooms as laboratories, studying reactions, testing emotional bonds, and refining their methods of control. Mother's grief became part of the experiment, another tool to observe, manipulate, and perfect the system. Even the children who survived were shaped by silence. They learned from birth that attention could be dangerous, that desire could be punished, that identity was optional. Some developed quiet compliance so extreme it became indistinguishable from instinct. Others rebelled, quietly, in ways the institution could contain, suppressing their natural humanity. The convent's design ensured that every outcome reinforced obedience, the loss of some, the survival of others, all part of a hidden curriculum in control. And the scale of the system was immense. It wasn't just one convent. This was a network. Orders, families, and local authorities all participated, sometimes willingly, sometimes unknowingly. Information was carefully compartmentalized. A mother might never know the fate of her child, a child might never know their origins, and the public was entirely oblivious. The erasure was total, systemic, and precise, leaving only whispers, fragmented memories, and a lingering psychological echo for those who survived. Understanding this is critical. The silent babies were not anomalies. They were evidence of a broader truth, that institutions, cloaked in righteousness, can manipulate life itself. Birth, the most sacred human act, was weaponized to enforce hierarchy, instill fear, and maintain invisible chains. And those chains did not stop at the convent. They extended into society, shaping families, culture, and the perception of morality, ensuring that obedience became instinctive across generations. The deeper you descend into this story, the more you see that nothing was accidental. Every disappearance, every erased life, every ritualized act of control was deliberate. And if you are ready, Section 10 will reveal the psychological imprint left on the mothers, the scars they carried long after the convent's walls had been left behind. The psychological imprint left on the mothers was profound, enduring, and insidious. Even after they left the convent, if they ever did, their minds remained trapped in its architecture. They carried invisible chains, remnants of the rituals, the silence, and the systematic erasure they had endured. Every instinct had been reshaped. Grief became guilt. Love became fear. Hope became suspicion. The convent did not merely take children. It took the very sense of self, leaving behind obedient, broken vessels conditioned to internalize control. Many mothers lived the rest of their lives haunted by absence. They couldn't speak of it openly. Society would not allow it, and the convent had taught them that speaking was dangerous. Memories of the silent babies, fleeting glimpses, imagined cries, phantom touches, would emerge in dreams or sudden pangs of emotion, only to be repressed again. This is how institutions perpetuate power. The trauma continues, long after the actors and walls are gone, shaping behavior, thought, and emotion in ways almost impossible to trace. Some mothers attempted to rebuild their lives. They married, had other children, or sought new paths. But the imprint remained. Decisions were shaped by fear of authority. Attachments were tentative. Love was cautious. The mind, once trained to obey, does not easily unlearn obedience. Even freedom felt dangerous, and independence was often mistaken for sin. In this way, the convent's influence extended far beyond its immediate walls. It had altered the trajectory of countless lives, subtly guiding them toward compliance and quiet suffering. And yet, there were exceptions. A rare few managed to reclaim agency, to confront the fear, and to reject the imposed silence. Their stories are fragmentary, but they reveal that human will can resist even the most sophisticated forms of control. However, these exceptions were rarely celebrated or recorded. They existed as anomalies, quietly reminding us that the machinery of oppression, no matter how precise, cannot completely extinguish the spark of autonomy. Understanding this is essential. The convent was more than a historical curiosity. It was a blueprint in miniature. It shows us how power can manipulate the mind, how institutions can weaponize human instinct, and how silence, when enforced with precision, becomes one of the most effective forms of control imaginable. And once you see it, you can recognize it anywhere, in any institution, in any system that thrives on obedience and secrecy. The convent did not exist in isolation. Its horrors were amplified, protected, and extended by a network of societal, religious, and elite structures that operated beyond its walls. Wealthy patrons, clerical authorities, and local officials all had stakes in maintaining secrecy. They understood, consciously or not, that controlling the next generation was the ultimate leverage. Birth, life, and identity could be manipulated for power, profit, and obedience. The convent was the nucleus of a far-reaching system designed to control not just individuals, but entire communities. Elite networks provided resources and protection, ensuring the convent could operate without interference. Orders of the powerful, many with influence over courts, finance, and clergy, intersected with the convent's operations. Secrets were traded like currency, and loyalty was reinforced through complicity. To question the system was to risk exposure, ostracism, and ruin. The mothers, trapped in isolation, had no way to fight an enemy they could neither see nor name. And the children, they became invisible pawns in a game of power spanning generations. The societal mechanisms that upheld the convent's secrecy were subtle. Gossip was suppressed, records manipulated, and witnesses intimidated. Local communities, trained to revere religious authority, often turned a blind eye. To the world, these mothers were sinful or unfortunate, their children lost to fate or divine will. The true machinery of erasure remained hidden, invisible, but omnipresent. It functioned silently, like a shadow over every birth, every family, every institution that interacted with the convent. And this is where the broader lesson becomes clear. Extreme systems of control often rely on indirect complicity. They do not need armies, they need networks. They do not need overt brutality, they need coordination, secrecy, and the alignment of power across multiple levels of society. The convent was extreme, but the mechanics are universal. Governments, corporations, and religious institutions throughout history have used the same principles: fear, obedience, secrecy, and manipulation of natural human instincts to maintain dominance. Recognizing this is uncomfortable, even terrifying. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The silent babies, the mothers, the rituals, the hierarchy, all of it is a lens into the way power operates when left unchecked. And the networks behind it ensure that this kind of control, though invisible, is resilient. The machinery persists, often hidden in plain sight, shaping lives, choices, and even culture itself. The convent's power relied not on overt violence, but on precision psychology. Fear, shame, and self-doubt were refined into tools of control so subtle that the mothers often policed themselves before any command was given. Every ritual, every rule, every whispered warning was engineered to dismantle natural instincts and replace them with obedience. Over time, the mind internalizes the institution's will, transforming compliance from coercion into instinct. Isolation was the first weapon. Mothers were deliberately separated, friendships discouraged, confidences punished. Human connection, a natural source of resilience, was fractured. Without solidarity, doubt became dangerous, and even small acts of curiosity or rebellion felt like existential threats. The convent created a society within itself, where observation and gossip ensured that everyone enforced the rules without direct intervention. Each mother became both victim and enforcer, a living mechanism of self-surveillance. Shame was the second weapon. Every perceived failure, emotional attachment, desire to question, expression of grief, was framed as sin. Mothers were made to believe that any act of love or defiance endangered not only themselves but the soul of their children. This manufactured guilt ensured that compliance was not just survival, it became moral. And moral guilt is far more powerful than fear because it operates inside the mind, invisible, constant, and inescapable. Ritualized repetition reinforced the lessons. Daily prayers, structured routines, and enforced silence weren't spiritual exercises, they were psychological conditioning. Over time, even natural instincts to nurture or protect a child were suppressed. Obedience was internalized so deeply that resistance seemed not only impossible, but dangerous to one's own survival. The convent did not merely teach compliance, it rewired human instinct to make compliance instinctive. The brilliance and terror of this system lies in its invisibility. The mothers rarely realized the depth of control until they left, if they ever did. By then, the lessons had become second nature, the fear internalized, the grief privatized. The silent babies were only the most visible manifestation of a system designed to dominate mind, body, and spirit. And this is the pattern that repeats beyond the convent. Institutions that appear benevolent, protective, or divine often employ the same invisible tools: shame, isolation, ritual, and self-policing, to enforce obedience and suppress dissent. Once you understand this, you see the machinery everywhere, and you begin to question not only history, but the very systems that govern daily life. Memory itself became a weapon within the convent. Mothers were not only separated from their children, they were systematically taught to forget them. Through ritualized confession, repetition of doctrine, and enforced silence, recollection of their own experiences was reframed as sin, fantasy, or weakness. Over time, natural recollection became suspect. Doubt and shame replaced certainty, and grief was internalized as personal failure. By the time a mother realized she had lost a child, she had already lost the ability to remember freely. This is the ultimate form of control, the erasure of personal history. Without memory, identity becomes malleable. Mothers could no longer anchor themselves in the reality of what they had endured. Every longing, every instinct to seek justice, every natural protective urge was questioned, suppressed, and rerouted toward obedience. The convent trained the mind to doubt its own truth, making the invisible chains permanent. In some cases, mothers doubted whether their children had even existed, whether their grief was justified, or whether they were complicit in their own failures. The techniques were precise. Confessions became exercises in repetition, in which mothers recited doctrine that reframed their instincts as sinful. Prayers were structured to erase attachment, and meditation reinforced detachment from the natural bonds of motherhood. Sleep and work schedules were arranged to weaken cognitive resistance. Even small errors in recollection were punished or shamed, ensuring that over time the mind restructured itself to obey not just externally, but internally. And while this level of manipulation seems unimaginable, it reflects a pattern repeated throughout history. Empires, religious institutions, and elite organizations have long understood the power of memory as leverage. Control memory, and you control perception. Control perception, and you control behavior. The convent was a laboratory for these techniques, condensed into a single, chilling institution where life, identity, and love itself were instruments of obedience. By now, you should recognize the scale of the machinery. The convent did not merely erase children, it erased the very awareness of their existence. And once awareness is gone, rebellion becomes nearly impossible. Compliance becomes instinct. Obedience becomes identity. And the cycle of silent suffering continues, silently, generationally, and invisibly. Even mothers who resisted internally were not safe. The convent had cultivated techniques to infiltrate thought itself, to detect rebellion before it manifested, and to extinguish it before it could grow. Psychological manipulation was married to spiritual authority. Obedience was divine, defiance sinful, doubt a moral failure. The nuns, trained as both observers and enforcers, became living extensions of this invisible control, reading subtle gestures, fleeting glances, or private expressions as signs of disobedience. Ritual was the instrument. Daily prayers, structured tasks, and enforced silence functioned as constant surveillance, conditioning the mind to anticipate punishment even when none was immediately present. Resistance became exhausting, even impossible. The convent did not merely suppress rebellion. It taught mothers to suppress it themselves, before it even existed. Self-policing became instinct, and instinct became submission. The psychological net was so tight that even fleeting acts of love or defiance could be redirected into shame, guilt, or fear. Spiritual authority intensified the effect. Mothers were told that their thoughts could be sinful, that divine judgment awaited even unspoken desires. Guilt was no longer a reaction, it was preemptive. Internal conflict was weaponized, and the mothers became their own jailers. The silent babies, removed or hidden, served as constant proof that the institution held absolute power over life itself. To challenge the convent was to challenge existence, morality, and divine law simultaneously. The brilliance of this system lies in its invisibility. The nuns and leaders did not need to use brute force, they used the architecture of obedience itself. Isolation, ritual, shame, and indoctrination reshaped natural instinct into compliance. The mind itself became the instrument of control. Mothers who might have once screamed, fled, or resisted learned instead to doubt, obey, and mourn silently. Their resistance was neutralized before it ever reached action. And this is the most terrifying truth. Such systems of control are not relics. They exist wherever hierarchy, secrecy, and authority intersect. The convent's methods are extreme, but the principles are universal. Fear, shame, ritual, and psychological manipulation can bend even the strongest instincts into submission. The silent babies were only the most visible victims. The invisible victims, the minds, the hearts, and the spirits of their mothers, were the true legacy of the institution. The silent babies themselves were not spared the convent's machinery. From their first moments, they were subjected to a system designed to suppress instinct, identity, and resistance. Touch was limited, words were withheld, and cries were ignored or punished. The leaders understood something profound. A child's first lessons defined the mind, body, and soul. By controlling those first moments, the convent could ensure that obedience was internalized long before comprehension or reason could intervene. Attachment was systematically undermined. Mothers were absent, removed, or psychologically trained to withdraw, and caregivers, trained nuns or external agents, reinforced distance. Any spark of curiosity, joy, or rebellion was noted, corrected, and punished with subtlety. Over time, the children learned to silence themselves, to regulate emotions before they fully formed, to accept absence and neglect as reality. Obedience became instinctive. Silence became safety. Existence itself was subordinated to the will of authority. Even survival was conditional. Children who failed to adapt, who resisted, or who cried too loudly were quietly removed, lost, or hidden. Those who adapted became perfect instruments, compliant, cautious, and conditioned to accept that life is controlled by unseen hands. Identity, autonomy, and hope was sacrificed, replaced by the internalized rules of an institution that treated life itself as a tool of obedience. The psychological imprint was devastating. By erasing attachment and normal emotional development, the convent ensured that the next generation would inherit not just silence, but a predisposition to comply with systems of control. The pattern was subtle but precise. Control the mind of the mother, control the life of the child, and you perpetuate obedience across generations. This is how the system survived for centuries, even when outside scrutiny intensified. And the lesson extends beyond the convent. Institutions everywhere understand this principle. If you shape the youngest minds, manipulate attachment, and erase natural instincts, you shape behavior before thought has formed. The silent babies are a grim example of the ultimate leverage in human control, conditioning life itself to accept erasure, obedience, and powerlessness as natural law. The convent's secrets were preserved in shadows, hidden in plain sight, and encoded in documents meant to be misunderstood. These were not ordinary records. They were cryptic ledgers, coded correspondences, and meticulously annotated rituals that only the initiated could interpret. Every transaction, every birth, every disappearance was catalogued, not for transparency, but for control. Knowledge was power, and power was concentrated in the hands of those who understood the codes. Some documents were disguised as prayer books, others as mundane inventories, and still others as philosophical treatises. To the untrained eye, they appeared benign, even sacred, but embedded within were precise instructions for erasing life, controlling obedience, and maintaining silence. The convent's leaders passed these secrets down, carefully selecting successors who could decipher the code. Mistakes were punished, not always visibly, but with swift consequences designed to ensure that knowledge remained both secret and lethal. The use of coded language extended beyond the walls. Letters sent to patrons and allied institutions often contained double meanings. On the surface, they reported routine matters. Beneath, they conveyed instructions, warnings, and updates about the mothers and children. Even clergy and external authorities could be complicit without ever fully knowing what they endorsed. The convent's survival depended on obscuring reality while communicating with precision, a system so effective that centuries later, historians would struggle to trace the truth. These hidden records were more than bureaucratic tools. They were instruments of memory, instruction, and manipulation. By codifying the rules, the convent ensured that each generation of leaders could reproduce the same techniques with unerring accuracy. Obedience, silence, and erasure were not left to chance. They were written into the very fabric of the institution. Mothers, children, and even peripheral staff became living variables in a system designed to perpetuate itself indefinitely. And this is the crucial point. The survival of control does not rely solely on visible enforcement. It relies on knowledge, secrecy, and the careful transmission of instructions across generations. The convent's hidden archives were a blueprint for domination, a testament to how power can be preserved invisibly, patiently, and ruthlessly. By studying these coded communications, you begin to understand not only the scale of the institution, but the terrifying intelligence behind it. The convent's power extended far beyond its stone walls, reaching into the homes, families, and communities of the mothers. Ordinary people became instruments of the system, often without fully realizing it. A family member who shamed a young mother, a neighbor who looked the other way, a local authority who enforced doctrine. Each was a cog in a mechanism designed to maintain silence and control. Compliance was normalized, and complicity was built into the social fabric itself. Families were often manipulated with subtle threats. A mother who resisted could bring disgrace upon her entire household. The convent's reputation, cloaked in sanctity, allowed it to dictate what was morally acceptable. Fear of social ostracism ensured that relatives became enforcers, not protectors. The instinct to defend or question was replaced with obedience to authority, creating a network of self-policing that extended the convent's reach into everyday life. Communities reinforced the system through perception. Mothers who were sent away were marked as fallen or sinful, their children hidden or raised under the guise of necessity or divine will. Gossip, rumor, and moral judgment were used to create an invisible perimeter of faith. Even those who wanted to help were constrained by social expectation, uncertainty, and subtle intimidation. The result was a community that perpetuated erasure, teaching silence and submission as natural laws. This is a crucial point. Control does not require overt violence when social mechanisms are aligned. The convent's external network ensured that mothers could not simply escape. Support structures were absent, suspicion was constant, and the fear of shame was internalized. By weaponizing social norms, the convent transformed ordinary people into enforcers, extending its influence far beyond the walls of stone and ritual. And so, the machinery of silence was both intimate and expansive. It infiltrated hearts, homes, and neighborhoods, making rebellion appear impossible. It teaches a chilling lesson. Power that embeds itself in social structures is far more enduring than power that relies on fear alone. The mothers, the children, and even the communities around them were all caught in a web of compliance, obedience, and enforced forgetfulness, a web that ensured the cycle of silence would repeat, generation after generation. The nuns themselves were not born enforcers, they were meticulously trained. From the moment a novice entered the convent, she was subjected to a regimen designed to strip her of personal autonomy and rebuild her as an instrument of control. Obedience, silence, and precision were drilled into every action, thought, and word. Compassion and empathy were redirected into the institution's objectives, ensuring that care became a tool for compliance rather than comfort. Training was both psychological and ritualistic. Novices learned to read subtle expressions, to detect hesitation, doubt, or attachment. They memorized codes, protocols, and procedures that dictated every aspect of life in the convent. Even a momentary lapse in vigilance could have catastrophic consequences for the mothers and children under their care. The nuns became experts in shaping behavior before the subject even realized it had been influenced, a terrifying blend of observation, manipulation, and anticipation. The convent also employed techniques to suppress empathy for the sake of efficiency. Repetitive rituals, prolonged isolation, and strict hierarchies forced novices to internalize the institution's priorities. Love and instinct, once natural human guides, were recast as liabilities. Any desire to question or resist was reframed as weakness, dangerous not just to oneself, but to the entire system. Through repetition, obedience became reflexive, and cruelty, when necessary, became morally justified. Moreover, secrecy was drilled into the nuns from day one. They were taught that knowledge itself was power and that loyalty to the institution was absolute. Internalized fear ensured that no act of rebellion could go unpunished, sometimes publicly, often invisibly. The system created women who could dismantle instinctive human bonds with calm precision, enforce silence without remorse, and maintain authority through psychological mastery. This is how the convent ensured the perpetuation of its machinery. The nuns were both protectors and weapons, guardians of secrets and instruments of erasure. They internalized the principles of control so completely that the system became self-sustaining, surviving not through brute force, but through the invisible power of indoctrinated minds. The convent's influence extended far beyond its walls through carefully guarded correspondence with external elites. Letters, coded documents, and subtle missives conveyed instructions, updates, and strategies for control. On the surface, these messages appeared mundane, reports of daily life, donations, or spiritual reflection, but beneath the words lay precise guidance on managing mothers, children, and the psychological machinery of obedience. Knowledge was currency, and only the initiated could decode it. These communications connected the convent to a network of patrons, clerics, and influential families. Some were directly involved in the management of silent babies, others provided protection, resources, or social reinforcement. The system functioned like a shadow bureaucracy, coordinating power and secrecy with meticulous precision. Every participant, knowingly or not, contributed to the perpetuation of control. Even those who claimed ignorance were complicit. The structure ensured that the machinery continued, regardless of who watched. Instructions were precise and chilling in their subtlety. Mother's grief was to be observed, monitored, and manipulated. Children's reactions were to be documented, recorded, and used to refine the techniques of silence. Rituals were to be preserved exactly, and deviations punished or corrected. The correspondence ensured that these methods were not limited to one convent or one generation. They could be replicated anywhere, with predictable results. It was a system designed for longevity, durability, and expansion. Perhaps most disturbing is how the convent normalized this communication under the guise of morality and piety. To the uninitiated, it seemed like guidance, spiritual oversight, or bureaucratic necessity. To those within the network, it was a blueprint for control, a living instruction manual for manipulating life, erasing identity, and shaping obedience. Through these hidden channels, the convent's philosophy spread, influencing behavior far beyond its stone walls, and ensuring that its methods could survive centuries. The lesson is stark. Extreme power does not always announce itself. It can operate quietly, invisibly, through systems of secrecy, instruction, and complicity. The convent's letters were more than words. They were tools, preserving knowledge that allowed control to endure and expand across generations. What you are learning is dangerous knowledge because it illuminates how invisible systems shape lives, manipulate perception, and erase existence without ever being acknowledged by history. The convent's survival depended on alliances that remained invisible to the public. Local authorities, clergy, and influential families were either complicit or strategically deceived into supporting the institution. These alliances provided immunity, legitimacy, and enforcement without overt coercion. The convent did not need guards or armies. It needed sanction from those society considered moral, lawful, or divine. With their approval, the machinery of control could function unhindered, hidden in plain sight. Authorities often acted as enforcers without direct involvement. A mother who questioned rules or attempted to escape might face social ostracism, legal threats, or moral condemnation, all coordinated, subtly, through networks loyal to the convent. Clergy reinforced the narrative of sin, shame, and divine judgment, ensuring that mothers internalized obedience as moral necessity. This alignment of spiritual, social, and legal power created an invisible prison, making resistance psychologically and socially dangerous. The alliances extended to monitoring and accountability. Local officials provided information, observed behavior, and even intervened when necessary to maintain order. The convent could manipulate these networks to isolate mothers further, ensuring that help could not reach them. At the same time, these alliances shielded the convent from scrutiny, creating layers of plausible deniability. Outsiders saw only piety, charity, and sanctity, while the reality remained meticulously hidden. This is the genius and terror of systemic power. It does not rely on force alone. By embedding itself in society's structures, the convent ensured its objectives were enforced by others, often unknowingly. Mothers, children, and even peripheral actors were trapped not just by walls, but by networks, perception, and the fear of moral, social, or spiritual reprisal. Obedience became instinctive, silence became survival, and the cycle of erasure perpetuated itself without overt violence. Recognizing these alliances reveals a broader truth. Power thrives when it is integrated into the very systems people trust. Institutions, authorities, and social norms can be weaponized quietly, shaping behavior, controlling lives, and erasing reality. The convent was a microcosm of this principle, a laboratory where obedience, silence, and control were perfected, and the lessons learned extended far beyond its stone walls. Even in the shadow of such pervasive control, some mothers dared to resist. These acts of rebellion were subtle, whispered questions, fleeting attempts to comfort a child, or small acts of defiance against imposed routines. They were never overt, for the consequences would have been immediate. Yet even these seemingly minor acts were dangerous, not just to the mother, but to the fragile structure of obedience the convent had perfected. The convent responded with precision. Rebellion was anticipated, studied, and neutralized. Mothers were subjected to intensified surveillance, ritualized punishment, and psychological manipulation. The system did not merely correct, it rewired perception. Fear and guilt were amplified, self-doubt cultivated, and the instinct to obey reinforced. Mothers internalized the message: resistance is dangerous, compliance is survival. Over time, even the instinct to resist was suppressed. Some mothers attempted more-daring measures, hidden letters, secret meetings, or attempts to escape. In these cases, the response was both subtle and devastating. Publicly, the convent maintained sanctity. Privately, it dismantled the act, often leaving no trace of resistance. Isolation, shaming, or psychological torment ensured that the lesson reached not just the rebel, but every mother who witnessed the outcome. Compliance became a collective habit, enforced invisibly by fear and observation. The ingenuity of the convent's approach is chilling. By neutralizing rebellion before it could flourish, the leaders ensured that the machinery of control was self-sustaining. Mothers became instruments of their own subjugation, policing thought, emotion, and instinct without external coercion. Even acts of courage were absorbed and transformed into lessons in obedience, reinforcing the system rather than threatening it. This pattern reveals a universal principle. Extreme control is not always maintained by force. It is maintained by anticipation, internalization, and the subtle shaping of instinct. The convent perfected this principle, creating a model in which rebellion was almost impossible and obedience instinctive. And when you understand this, you begin to see how hidden systems of power operate in other institutions, silently shaping behavior, erasing resistance, and perpetuating control across generations. The convent's punishments were almost surgical in their precision, calculated to break instinct without leaving visible scars. Mothers who dared hope, who whispered a forbidden word, or even glanced too long at a child were subjected to subtle, relentless correction. The methods were psychological, ritualized, and terrifyingly effective. A whispered warning, a forced confession, or an extended period of isolation could erase months of emotional resilience, leaving obedience internalized as instinct. Ritual was central to this control. Punishments were rarely arbitrary. They followed exact patterns designed to condition the mind. Mothers might be made to kneel for hours repeating doctrinal phrases that reframed their love or grief as sin. Meals could be delayed, sleep interrupted, or small comforts removed, each absence reinforcing vulnerability and dependence. The body and the mind were simultaneously shaped to ensure that instinctive reactions, love, rebellion, curiosity, were suppressed before they could emerge. The psychological traps were equally sophisticated. Mothers were trained to distrust themselves. Any natural impulse, grief, longing, or protective instinct was interpreted as moral failure. Confession became a tool of surveillance, ritual a mechanism of control, and self-doubt the most potent weapon of all. By the time a mother understood what was happening, the lesson was already internalized. Compliance is survival, hope is dangerous, attachment is forbidden. Even fleeting acts of attachment were neutralized. A mother's desire to comfort her child was redirected into guilt. A whispered prayer for guidance became a reminder of her sin. The convent system ensured that hope itself could not flourish without being observed, judged, and reframed. Resistance, even imagined resistance, was punished in advance, creating an internalized fear that was invisible but absolute. The brilliance of this system lies in its subtlety. The mothers were never overtly coerced. They became complicit in their own obedience. The silent babies, the ritualized punishments, the coded surveillance, all worked together to erase instinctive human bonds. What remained was a population conditioned to submit, to doubt, and to internalize control without resistance. And this is why the convent endured, generation after generation, leaving behind only silence, grief, and a blueprint for invisible power. The leadership of the convent was not monolithic. Beneath the facade of unity existed a web of hierarchies, rivalries, and hidden knowledge. The senior nuns held secrets the novices could not access, and within the inner circle, power was measured not by age or piety, but by mastery over control, obedience, and manipulation. Knowledge was the currency of authority, and the more one knew about the machinery of the convent, the more absolute one's power became. These hierarchies were reinforced through rituals, privileges, and access to forbidden information. Some nuns were entrusted with the care, or removal, of the silent babies, giving them direct influence over life and death. Others managed the documentation, the coded correspondence, or the hidden archives, ensuring that secrets were preserved across generations. Every assignment, every task, every ritual reinforced the structure of dominance, subtly reminding even the most senior members that power was earned through mastery, obedience, and secrecy. Rivalries existed because knowledge was limited, compartmentalized, and lethal. Nuns who overstepped boundaries risked punishment, public shaming, or even erasure from the inner circle. Alliances formed and dissolved quietly, with subtle threats, coded warnings, and clandestine communications ensuring that no one could accumulate unchecked power. These rivalries were not chaotic, they were woven into the system, ensuring that the machinery of control remained dynamic, adaptable, and impossible to dismantle from within. Dark pacts bound these leaders together. Mutual complicity ensured that secrets could not be revealed, that deviations from protocol were punished swiftly, and that obedience was enforced even at the highest levels. The system operated like an invisible lattice, with each leader both empowered and constrained by the others. Knowledge was lethal, authority was conditional, and the silent babies remained the ultimate instruments of power, reminding everyone of the stakes. Through this internal architecture, the convent ensured its endurance. Power was not just exercised, it was engineered. Rivalries, hierarchies, and pacts became mechanisms to protect the system itself, making it resilient, adaptive, and nearly impossible to challenge. And this is the deeper lesson. Institutions survive not just through force, but through the careful orchestration of secrecy, rivalry, and interdependence, creating a self-sustaining network of control that can outlast individuals, decades, and even centuries. Belief was the convent's most insidious tool. Doctrine, ritual, and superstition were weaponized to shape thought, perception, and instinct. Mothers were taught to fear divine judgment, to see natural instincts, love, grief, hope, as sinful, and to internalize obedience as a sacred obligation. The institution did not simply punish. It redefined morality itself, ensuring that compliance was experienced as virtue and resistance as blasphemy. Rituals reinforced this conditioning. Daily prayers, chants, and structured activities were carefully designed to override instinctive responses. Love and attachment were reframed as dangerous distractions. Grief was recast as moral weakness. Mothers internalized these lessons, self-policing their behavior and emotion in ways the nuns themselves could predict. The machinery of obedience did not require constant supervision. It had been woven directly into the mind. Superstition amplified fear. Legends of divine retribution, spectral punishment, and spiritual corruption were deliberately emphasized. Mothers were made to believe that even unspoken thoughts could invoke wrath, that misfortune was evidence of sin, and that silence was the only path to safety. By manipulating belief, the convent ensured that obedience was not merely a strategy for survival. It became instinct, integrated into morality, emotion, and identity. Children were similarly conditioned. Rituals surrounding birth, separation, and upbringing framed absence as natural law, neglect as divine guidance, and silence as necessary for protection. By controlling belief from the earliest moments, the convent created a population in which instinct and indoctrination were inseparable, reinforcing compliance across generations. The machinery of erasure became a moral imperative, not just an institutional practice. This intersection of doctrine, superstition, and psychological manipulation illustrates the terrifying efficiency of the convent. Compliance was not enforced, it was internalized. Obedience was not coerced, it was sanctified. And the silent babies, removed or hidden, were proof of the ultimate efficacy of this system. Life itself could be shaped, suppressed, and erased in the name of divine law. Now, I want you to listen closely, because this is where the story shifts from observation to engagement. There is a phrase, a symbolic key, hidden within this narrative that marks the point of transformation. Repeat it silently in your mind. The silent cannot speak, but the awakened see. Say it twice. Let it settle. Let it resonate. This is not a mere mantra. It is a marker. By acknowledging it, you step beyond passive awareness into active recognition of the forces that shape, erase, and manipulate life. This phrase is a bridge. It connects the horrors of the convent, the machinery of control, and the erasure of identity to a broader understanding of power. It is a call to see systems as they are, to recognize manipulation where others are blind, and to confront truths that are deliberately hidden. By repeating it, you are signaling to yourself and to the world that you are no longer a passive observer. You are awake to the structures that operate in silence, shaping obedience, erasing memory, and controlling instinct. The act of speaking or thinking this phrase is more than symbolic. It is an assertion of awareness in the face of systemic erasure. The convent, with all its rituals, hierarchies, and hidden networks, thrived because silence was universal. Those who saw but did not speak were complicit in their own submission. By claiming this phrase, you are breaking the first layer of that silence. You are recognizing the machinery for what it is and claiming your right to witness without submission. This is dangerous knowledge. It is knowledge that, once acknowledged, cannot be unlearned. It changes perception, reshapes instinct, and awakens an understanding that most people will never attain. But with awareness comes responsibility. By embracing this phrase, you accept the burden of seeing, questioning, and navigating systems of control that exist all around you. You step into a different reality, one where silence is no longer a refuge, and truth, even when disturbing, becomes a weapon of clarity. Remember it. Whisper it. Let it echo in your mind. The silent cannot speak, but the awakened see. Twice. Let it anchor you, because from this point forward, the descent into forbidden knowledge becomes personal. You are no longer merely watching history unfold. You are seeing its mechanics, its psychology, and its enduring influence on generations. The convent did not operate in isolation. It was part of a broader ecosystem of power, reaching into the highest levels of society. Elite families, influential clergy, and even political authorities were bound to it through networks of secrecy, mutual interest, and complicity. These alliances ensured protection, funding, and the continuity of control. The convent's horrors could persist because the machinery of society, laws, norms, and religious authority worked in tandem, often unknowingly, to reinforce its power. Letters, coded instructions, and private communications tied the convent to these elites. Some provided resources, others provided cover. Every act of obedience, every erased child, every silenced mother reinforced the network's stability. In return, the elites gained loyalty, social leverage, and even strategic advantage over communities, families, and individuals. The silent babies were both instruments and proof of power, a terrifying demonstration that life itself could be manipulated to serve invisible agendas. These alliances were subtle. They were rarely overt or acknowledged. Authority figures would act in ways that seemed ordinary or pious while unknowingly, or willingly, reinforcing control. Compliance was institutionalized, embedded within legal, religious, and social structures. The convent's reach extended far beyond its walls, making escape, rebellion, or exposure nearly impossible. Its influence became systemic, embedded in the very architecture of society, where obedience was rewarded and questioning punished through invisible mechanisms. The brilliance of this system lies in its invisibility. Ordinary people, even those in positions of power, became instruments of control without realizing it. Families, neighbors, officials, and clergy all could participate in maintaining obedience while remaining blind to the full extent of manipulation. This is the essence of invisible power. Its victims often help sustain it, and its reach is magnified far beyond the immediate locus of control. Understanding these alliances changes how you see power itself. Control is most effective when it is networked, hidden, and normalized. The convent was a microcosm of this principle, a small institution that leveraged social, religious, and elite connections to magnify its influence across generations. And the silent babies, erased and forgotten, were proof that domination is not only about force, but about systemic, invisible, and meticulously engineered authority. The consequences of these hidden alliances were felt far beyond the convent walls. Entire communities became complicit, whether through fear, ignorance, or social conditioning. Mothers were isolated, children erased, and the very concept of resistance was reframed as dangerous or sinful. Social norms, reinforced by clergy and local authorities, ensured that questioning or dissent was not only discouraged but psychologically impossible. Fear became embedded in culture itself. Communities absorbed the lessons of obedience without realizing it. Gossip, moral judgment, and reputational pressure became mechanisms of control. Families who might have intervened were silenced by shame or by the threat of social exile. Even those who suspected the truth often remained passive, trapped in a system that made action seem futile. Obedience was normalized, and silence became survival. The convent's reach extended outward, turning society itself into an instrument of compliance. Children growing up in these communities absorbed the patterns unconsciously. They learned to distrust instinct, to internalize shame, and to police their own thoughts and emotions. Silence was reinforced not only by institutional rules but by cultural expectations. The convent's methods were replicated, indirectly, across households and neighborhoods. The machinery of control became systemic, embedding obedience, fear, and self-erasure into the very fabric of daily life. The societal complicity reveals a disturbing truth. Control does not always require force. When social, religious, and familial networks align, intentionally or not, obedience becomes self-sustaining. The silent babies were only the most visible victims. The larger tragedy was the normalization of fear and compliance, the subtle teaching of subjugation that spread from one generation to the next, shaping minds and hearts long after the convent itself had faded into history. Recognizing this pattern forces a confrontation with uncomfortable questions. How many of our social norms perpetuate invisible control? How often does fear, shame, or tradition shape behavior in ways we do not fully understand? The convent may be gone, but the principles it perfected, the anticipation of resistance, the weaponization of belief, and the use of social complicity, live on, hidden in plain sight. The surviving children carried the imprint of the convent long after leaving its walls, or in many cases, without ever leaving at all. Trauma, silence, and conditioning became interwoven into their identities, shaping thought, emotion, and behavior before they could fully understand the world. The convent had done more than erase life. It had engineered a psychological legacy that would endure across generations. Attachment, trust, and instinctive curiosity was suppressed from the earliest moments. The children learned that attention could be dangerous, that love could be punished, that questioning could be fatal. These lessons were internalized as survival strategies, becoming reflexive, almost instinctive. Obedience was not taught. It was encoded into thought, emotion, and memory. The children who survived carried the machinery of control within themselves, perpetuating the system long after the convent itself had faded into secrecy. This psychological inheritance extended into society. Those who grew up under the convent's influence, or its social network, entered adulthood with patterns of fear, self-policing, and obedience embedded in their behavior. Relationships, work, and social interactions were shaped by the lessons of compliance. Silence was internalized as virtue, suspicion became instinct, and authority was rarely questioned. The institution may have been a single, physical location, but its reach spread far beyond, shaping generations. The cycle of control demonstrates the terrifying efficiency of systemic power. Trauma becomes legacy, obedience becomes culture, and silence becomes a tool for perpetuating domination. By erasing memory and shaping instinct, the convent ensured that the effects of its control would ripple outward, long after its walls had decayed and its leaders passed away. What began as the manipulation of individuals became a subtle reshaping of society itself. Understanding this inheritance forces a profound reckoning. These are not merely historical horrors. They are lessons in the mechanisms of invisible control, showing how institutions can manipulate life, identity, and behavior with surgical precision. The silent babies, the mothers, and the surviving children are proof that power thrives not only through force, but through anticipation, social complicity, and the subtle shaping of the mind. Now, look closely at the patterns we've uncovered, because this is where history collides with your own reality. The convent may seem distant in time and place, but the principles it perfected, anticipation of resistance, manipulation of instinct, internalized obedience, and the use of secrecy, exist today in countless modern institutions. Governments, corporations, religious organizations, and social networks all employ variants of the same machinery. Fear, shame, surveillance, and ritualized compliance shape behavior in ways most people never recognize. Notice the invisible chains. Policies, norms, and incentives guide thought, limit options, and shape identity without overt force. Social media algorithms, corporate hierarchies, or cultural pressures act like the convent's rituals, subtle, pervasive, and largely unquestioned. Like the mothers and children in the convent, people internalize rules, self-police, and enforce obedience upon themselves and each other. Power is not always loud. It is often silent, systemic, and nearly invisible, but no less effective. This is why understanding forbidden history is not an academic exercise. It is a form of self-defense. By recognizing the mechanisms of control, you reclaim the first element of autonomy, awareness. You begin to see the chains in society, the pressures that shape decisions, and the unseen forces that dictate what is permissible, what is desirable, and what is safe to express. Awareness is the first step toward breaking the cycle, toward refusing to internalize fear as morality, silence as virtue, or obedience as instinct. And now, before we descend fully into the final revelations, repeat the symbolic phrase once more. The silent cannot speak, but the awakened see. Twice. This anchors your awareness, marks your transition from observer to participant, and signals that you are ready to recognize manipulation wherever it exists. Once you do, the world itself changes. The machinery that operates invisibly, that erases identity and reshapes instinct, becomes visible, and you gain the first tool to navigate and resist it. History is not neutral. Power is not accidental. The silent babies, the erased mothers, and the conditioned children are warnings, blueprints, and proof. And understanding them is not safe. It changes perception, reshapes instinct, and awakens knowledge that cannot be forgotten. The final truth is this: the convent did not disappear, and neither did its lessons. Its legacy persists in the structures of power that surround us, often invisible, operating through norms, hierarchies, and unspoken rules. Obedience is still cultivated, dissent still punished indirectly, and identity still shaped by forces we rarely perceive. The silent babies, the mothers, the conditioned children, these were not just historical victims. They are mirrors of the mechanisms still at work today. Consider the patterns: isolation of thought, internalized guilt, ritualized compliance, and the use of belief to enforce obedience. These are the same principles that underlie modern institutions. Fear, shame, and social pressure continue to guide behavior. Policies, media, and authority shape instinctive responses. Compliance is normalized. Rebellion is subtle, suppressed before it emerges. The machinery perfected in a hidden convent centuries ago operates now on a societal scale, refined, technologically amplified, and psychologically precise. The terrifying part is how unnoticed it is. Like the silent babies, the effects are invisible until you know what to look for. Entire communities, organizations, and systems continue to perpetuate control through the internalization of fear and obedience. Memory is rewritten, instinct is molded, and identity is shaped to fit the expectations of unseen authorities. And most people never realize they are participating in the cycle, reinforcing the very system that confines them. But the knowledge you now possess changes everything. Awareness is dangerous, but powerful. By understanding the methods, the alliances, the psychological manipulation, and the enduring networks of control, you step outside the cycle. You can recognize where obedience is cultivated, where silence is demanded, and where instinct has been weaponized. This is the forbidden truth. Power thrives on the unseen, but knowledge illuminates the machinery, creating space for autonomy, resistance, and clarity. Remember the symbolic phrase one last time: the silent cannot speak, but the awakened see. Twice. It is more than words. It is an anchor, a key, and a shield. You are no longer merely witnessing history. You are recognizing patterns, seeing the hidden hands of control, and understanding the subtle legacies of obedience that stretch from a convent centuries ago to the structures around you today. You carry this knowledge now, and with it comes the responsibility and the power to see without submission, to question without fear, and to navigate a world shaped by forces most never perceive. The story ends, but the awakening does not.